While George was working for the Postal Service and dabbling in oil, the woman who would become his wife, Nellie Goulding, also distinguished herself by becoming the first in her family to graduate from high school. Like her soon-to-be husband, she too graduated from the Corning High School, but in the class of 1895. Like him, she was 19 rather than 18, a reflection of the fact that farm and home chores often kept children from attending school regularly. This is her graduation portrait. Of the Goulding side of the family, what we know must be reconstructed from the surviving pages of the Goulding family Bible. Under the marriage entries, we see that Nellie's father, William Henry Goulding, son of a prominent medical doctor, had married Margaret Souders on February 7, 1870. Their children's birth dates are listed in the birth registry. Lydia, the eldest, nicknamed Lyd, was born in 1871. The second-born, Oliva, sometimes written as Olivia but nicknamed Leaf, was born in 1874. Elizabeth Ellen, or Nellie, in January of 1876. Two boys followed, Carl Wynne in 1877 and Paul, known as Sam, in 1879. A baby sister and brother followed too. Bertil, or Bertie, born in 1882, and William A., born in 1886. Of Margaret Souders Goulding, their mother, who was born in 1843, we have regrettably only this distant image, a portion of the photograph taken in 1889 in front of the Drake store and the Goulding home. There are no surviving photographs of her husband, but we do know from his Civil War discharge papers, written in longhand, that he was 5 feet 10½ inches high, he had fair skin, blue eyes, and above all, red hair. The red hair was passed on to his third-born, Nellie. In this 1895 photograph, notice Nellie's flawed smile. Perhaps this cosmetic defect, the separation in her front teeth, was the reason why she rarely smiled in a portrait, even in later life when dentures had long since corrected the problem. But the Goulding red hair was passed on to another generation as this early Eastman Kodachrome photograph taken in 1938 by son Jim illustrates. William F. Drake, Jr., Bill, and his carrot red hair dominate the photograph, but Nellie's strawberry-colored hair retained its color until her death at age 80. Of the Goulding girls, 4 in all, the two who became the closest were Oliva, or Leaf, shown here on the left, and Nellie on the right. The two were dissimilar in temperament. Nellie was self-assured, outspoken when she felt the need, quiet otherwise, and intellectually sharp, more so than her husband most of her children thought. Leaf, on the other hand, was quiet, unsure of herself, and submissive, qualities which didn't help when she became attracted to a hard-drinking Scotsman named Tom Napier. Jim Napier, Tom's soft-spoken older brother, had already married the oldest Goulding girl, Lydia. And when Jim learned of Leaf's interest in his brother, he met with her privately and told her of Tom's drinking. They married anyway, and soon had their only child, Rose Napier, but before long Tom became physically abusive. When Leaf came home once too often bruised and battered, her father's red hair bristled. So when Tom was out drinking one afternoon, William Goulding and 2 of his sons went to the house, collected Leaf's belongings, and the two were legally separated afterward. Being Catholics, divorce was not tenable. Leaf, almost saintly in her outlook, forgave Tom, although she rarely saw him again. Nellie despised him for the rest of his life. In the 1920s, when her husband George nonchalantly mentioned that he had run into Tom Napier in downtown Columbus, Nellie demanded to know whether he had spoken to him. When George said yes, Nellie said bitingly, "Well, if you see him again, greet him for me too. Just spit in his face." Of the other sisters, the eldest, Lydia, at the top in this print, was a striking-looking woman with the most assertive personality in the family. There were those who said that if Tom Napier had married Lydia, he wouldn't have lived to tell about it. In her 30s, when she was bothered by what today would probably be treated as PMS, her husband would warn the kids, "Tread carefully today, children. Mama's meaner than a sack full of weasels." The youngest girl, Bertie, seated in the foreground, remained quite attractive even in midlife. She married James E. Rogers of Corning. Their eldest son, James E. Rogers, Jr., became the first in either side of the family to earn the Ph.D. degree, to become a superintendent and later a college professor at Ohio University in the 1960s, and also the first to author a book. The lives of Nellie on the left and Leaf on the right took markedly different directions as adults. Nellie became Mrs. George T. Drake, and Leaf raised her high-spirited daughter, Rose, by taking in sewing. When Nellie and George Drake were married in 1896, it was clear from the start that they were an upward-bound family. Their first two children, again, would arrive in 1897, William Francis, named for his grandfathers Goulding and Drake, and Adeline, named for George's deceased mother, who was born in 1898. His father's namesake, George Thomas Drake, Jr., came along in August of 1900, and like the first two, was a healthy child. He was destined for a lifespan of nearly 94 years. Like the other children, George Jr. had inherited a nickname from his father, who had a penchant for such things. In George Jr.'s handwriting on this 1902 photograph, we see that 5-year-old William was known as Wing, 2-year-old George as Tonky, and 3-and-a-half-year-old Adeline had become C. This was taken in their backyard in Corning. 2 years after the death of the infant Dudley Hampton Drake, the next son arrived in October 1907. He was promptly nicknamed Ozzer by his father. Among the very first photographs taken of young Jim is this series of postage stamp-sized portraits where father and son, George Drake and James W. Drake, are shown together. The father is now wearing a toupee to cover his baldness. In the third of the three photos, interestingly, the otherwise austere George T. Drake showed a moment of self-effacing humor. As we'll see, he removed the toupee, put on a straw hat, and plunked the toupee on his little son's head. But a succession of toupees stayed with him throughout the rest of his 72-year lifespan. The demands of a budding political career kept George T. Drake traveling much of the time, and therefore made him an absentee father in the early 1900s. Here he's shown at the left at a San Antonio Republican Party gathering in 1907. He was photographed again the next year, wearing a derby and seated in the middle of an early autobus at the Mardi Gras in New Orleans. In October of 1905, he relocated his family from Corning to the county seat, New Lexington, where he began his 2 terms as auditor of Perry County. What enabled George to succeed both financially and politically was that he had negotiated a first with the county government. Instead of taking a salary, he got them to agree that he should receive a percentage of any revenues he could collect, or ones that he might generate from new initiatives on the county's behalf. By 1909, when he was in his second term, his salary had risen to $5,200, making him the highest-paid civil servant in Perry County. By dint of his salary, he was able to purchase what today we would call men's toys. He's shown here as owner of the first automobile registered in New Lexington, Ohio, a 1910 Cleveland Garford made by the EMF company that he had bought as a result of his high earning power. We know exactly what he paid for the car because he saved the order form, which was typed on the letterhead of the auditor's office. It's dated 1910, and it shows the price of the car and its accessories. The order is for one EMF 4-door car, number 28964, priced at $1,100 less an 18% agent's discount of $198, bringing the total price, base price, to $902. The accessories ordered with the car and their prices included one top and windshield, discounted to $64. There were freight charges from Detroit to Columbus and handling charges as well, and 15 gallons of gasoline for the grand sum of $2.25. Naturally, a photographer was called to give the occasion some permanence. Here we see 13-year-old William standing at the left, and his father, dressed in a duster and heavy gloves, on the right. Adeline and George Jr., as well as a neighbor woman, Julia Cullen, sits with Nellie in the rear seat. Little Julia Cullen and young Jim Drake, childhood playmates, sit in the front seat. In another print taken that same day, we see George Drake posing ever so confidently behind the wheel. As he appears confidently in charge in his new automobile, he was equally confident that he was steering the right direction for the rest of his political life from 1910 onward.